Hello everyone, welcome back. Today's story begins with a single objection in a school meeting, when a black teacher is told she doesn't understand the culture. But when a child is pushed to the ground and everyone else looks away, she's the only one who steps forward. Stay with us to the end, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe one act of courage can change an entire community. The room was too quiet for a school. Inside the multi-purpose hall of Lincoln Elementary School, rows of folding chairs faced a small stage where a whiteboard listed the agenda. Welcome, expectations, culture and curriculum. Parents sat shoulder to shoulder, murmuring softly, sipping coffee from paper cups. Teachers stood along the walls, polite smiles fixed in place. At the front of the room stood Maya Johnson. She was 32, African-American, dressed in a beige cardigan over a white blouse, dark slacks pressed neatly. Her posture was straight, her voice calm. She had delivered this introduction dozens of times before. Her teaching philosophy, her classroom structure, her belief that children learn best when they feel safe and seen. And my goal, Maya said, meeting the room with steady eyes, is to make sure every student in my class knows they belong. A few parents nodded, others did not. From the third row, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. A man stood up. David Miller, white, early 40s, clean cut, arms crossed tight across his chest, as if bracing for an argument he'd already decided to win. "I have a concern," David said. The principal hesitated. "Mr. Miller." "I think parents deserve to speak," David cut in. Maya felt the shift immediately. The air changed. She kept her expression neutral. "Yes?" she said. David didn't look at her at first. He looked at the room. "My son is in your class," he said. "And frankly, I don't think you're the right fit." A ripple moved through the chairs. Maya's fingers tightened around the marker in her hand. "Could you explain what you mean?" David finally met her eyes. "I don't think you understand our culture," he said. "Our values, the way we raise our kids." The word "our" landed hard. A few parents shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Maya nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Culture is part of learning," she replied. "And children benefit from—" "That's exactly my point," David interrupted. "I don't want my child confused." Confused. Maya felt the familiar sting, not sharp, but heavy, the kind that came from knowing exactly what someone meant without them ever saying it. "So," Maya said carefully, "you're concerned about my curriculum?" "No," David said. "I'm concerned about you." The silence deepened. The principal cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller, Ms. Johnson is fully certified." "This isn't about paperwork," David snapped. "It's about whether someone like her can really relate to kids like mine." Maya's chest rose, then settled. She had learned long ago not to react the way people expected her to. "I grew up in this state," she said evenly. "I've taught in 3 districts. My students consistently perform above average." David shook his head. "Test scores aren't everything." "No," Maya agreed. "They're not." Then she paused. "But neither are assumptions." A murmur rippled through the room. David's jaw tightened. "I'm just saying what others are thinking." No one confirmed that. No one denied it either. Maya scanned the room, faces that avoided her eyes, a few that looked sympathetic, many that looked relieved they weren't the ones speaking. She felt alone. But she didn't step back. "I'm here to teach," Maya said, "and to protect every child in my classroom." David scoffed quietly. "Including mine?" "Especially yours," Maya said without hesitation. That did it. David let out a short laugh. "See? That's exactly the problem. You don't understand where we come from." Maya met his gaze. "I understand children," she said. And children need adults who don't put their fears on them. The principal stepped forward quickly. All right, let's take this offline. David sat down, but the damage had been done. The meeting moved on. Logistics, field trips, lunch schedules. Maya stood there, answering questions, smiling when appropriate. But inside, something had cracked. Not broken, but stressed. She had been challenged before, just never this publicly, never this directly. As parents began to leave, Maya noticed a small boy lingering near the door. Ethan Miller, 9 years old, light brown hair, backpack too big for his shoulders. He watched her with wide, uncertain eyes, as if trying to understand something he didn't have the words for. Maya offered him a gentle smile. Ethan didn't smile back. He followed his father out. Maya exhaled slowly. She gathered her notes, hands steady by force of habit. One of the other teachers leaned in, whispering, "Don't let it get to you." Maya nodded, but she knew. When adults draw lines, children bleed first. As she turned off the lights and stepped into the hallway, Maya felt the weight of what had just begun. Not a disagreement, but a test. And this time, it wouldn't end in a meeting room. If this opening struck you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because what starts as quiet resistance will soon turn into something much darker, and one teacher will be forced to choose between staying silent and standing alone. The bell rang at exactly 8:15 a.m. Children poured into the hallway of Lincoln Elementary School, their voices bouncing off the lockers, sneakers squeaking against polished floors. Backpacks swung, laughter echoed. To most, it was just another school morning. To Maya Johnson, it felt different. She stood at the doorway of her classroom, greeting students one by one. Her smile was warm, practiced, but her eyes were alert, searching. She had learned to read rooms the way some people read books, and this room was already telling a story. "Good morning, Liam." "Hi, Sophia." "Morning, Ethan." When Ethan Miller stepped inside, his eyes flicked up to Maya for half a second, then dropped to the floor. His shoulders were tight, his grip on his backpack straps too firm for a 9-year-old. Maya noticed. She always noticed. "Good morning, Ethan," she said gently. "Morning," he mumbled, slipping past her quickly. Maya watched him take a seat near the back of the room. He didn't talk to the boy beside him, didn't open his notebook, just sat there, small and quiet, like he was trying not to exist. Maya closed the door and turned to the class. "All right, everyone," she said, clapping once softly. "Let's get started." The lesson was simple: reading comprehension, followed by a group activity. Normally, the room buzzed with energy. Today, it buzzed with something else. Whispers. Maya moved between desks, listening as she always did. "That's his dad," a boy whispered. "He said she shouldn't teach here." "My mom said she's different." Maya stopped behind a bookshelf, out of sight. Different. She felt the word press into her chest like a thumb finding a bruise. She watched Ethan again. 2 boys across the aisle leaned toward him, smirking. "Hey," one of them muttered. "Your dad doesn't like her, right?" Ethan didn't answer. "Guess that means you don't either," the other added, louder. Ethan's ears turned red. Maya stepped forward. "Is there something you'd like to share with the class?" she asked calmly. The boys straightened instantly. "No, Ms. Johnson." "Then let's focus on our work," Maya said evenly. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. At recess, the school playground was alive with noise. Children ran, shouted, climbed, chased one another across the blacktop. Teachers stood along the edges, monitoring, chatting quietly. Maya stood near the fence, eyes scanning constantly. Ethan sat alone on a bench, lunchbox unopened beside him. A group of boys ran past, then slowed. "Why are you sitting with her?" one of them asked, nodding toward Maya across the yard. Ethan shook his head. I'm not. Then why are you always quiet? Another boy said. You scared? Ethan looked down. Maybe you're just like her, the first boy said, snickering. That was when Maya moved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She walked, purposeful, steady, until she stood between Ethan and the boys. That's enough, she said. The boys froze. Back to playing, Maya continued. Now. They scattered, muttering. Maya crouched slightly so she was at Ethan's eye level. You okay? She asked. Ethan nodded too fast. I'm fine. Maya knew that answer. She didn't push. Lunch is almost over, she said softly. Try to eat something, okay? Ethan nodded again. Maya stood and walked back toward the building. She felt eyes on her back. Later that afternoon, Maya sat in the principal office. The principal, Mr. Harris, folded his hands together, sighing. We've had a few concerns, he said carefully. Maya met his gaze. About what? Classroom dynamics, he replied. Some parents feel tensions might be affecting their children. Maya didn't miss the wording. Which parents? She asked. Mr. Harris hesitated. Let's not make this about individuals. It already is, Maya said calmly. He shifted in his chair. We're just asking you to be mindful. Adjust your approach. Adjust how? Maya asked. Maybe avoid sensitive topics, he suggested. Focus on neutral ground. Maya stared at him. You mean ignore what's happening? She asked. Mr. Harris looked uncomfortable. We don't want to escalate things. Maya nodded slowly. She stood. Silence doesn't de-escalate harm, she said. It just hides it. Mr. Harris didn't respond. That evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table in his family's neat suburban home. His backpack lay open, homework untouched. David Miller flipped through his phone nearby. You got homework? David asked. Ethan nodded. Yeah. David glanced at him. You like your teacher? Ethan hesitated. I guess, he said quietly. David frowned. You don't sound sure. Ethan shrugged. Kids say stuff. What kind of stuff? Ethan shook his head. Nothing. David leaned back, dismissive. You'll be fine. But Ethan didn't feel fine. The next morning, Maya stood at her classroom door again. She greeted Ethan as he walked in. This time, he looked up. Just for a second. And in his eyes, Maya saw it clearly. Fear. Not of school, not of learning. Fear of being alone. Maya straightened her shoulders. Whatever had begun in that meeting room was no longer abstract. It had a name, a face, a child, and silence was no longer an option. If this scene resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because when adults refuse to listen, children pay the price, and the next moment will push everything past the point of quiet harm. By the third week of school, the change was impossible to ignore. Not for Maya Johnson. She stood at the front of her classroom, writing vocabulary words on the whiteboard, while 24 children copied them into their notebooks. The room was quiet, too quiet in one corner. Maya glanced back. Ethan Miller sat rigid at his desk, shoulders slightly hunched, pencil hovering above the page. He wasn't writing. He was listening. Behind him, two boys leaned toward each other, whispering. Their eyes flicked to Ethan, then to Maya, then back to Ethan again. Maya turned suddenly. The boys snapped upright. Eyes on your work, she said calmly. Yes, Ms. Johnson, they replied in unison. Maya nodded and returned to the board, but she didn't relax. Years in the classroom had taught her something important. Bullying didn't start with fists. It started with glances, with silence, with permission, and someone had given permission. At recess, The school playground shimmered under the bright afternoon sun. The blacktop radiated heat. Children's voices rose and fell like waves. Ethan stood near the edge of the basketball court, pretending to retie his shoe. He didn't want to play. He didn't want to be seen. A ball bounced nearby, then rolled to a stop at his feet. "Hey," a boy said. "Throw it back." Ethan bent to pick it up. As he stood, someone bumped into him hard. The ball flew out of his hands. "Watch it," another boy snapped. I didn't mean," Ethan began. "Of course you didn't," a voice mocked. "You never do." The boys laughed. Ethan felt his face burn. He glanced around the playground, searching for an adult. Teachers stood at the edges, talking among themselves. None were close enough. "Your dad said she doesn't belong here," one boy said, lowering his voice. "Guess that makes you weird too." Ethan shook his head. "Leave me alone." The boy stepped closer. "Or what?" Ethan backed up, heel catching on the edge of the curb. He stumbled and fell. Hard. The sound of his body hitting the ground was sharp and final. Laughter erupted. Ethan lay there, stunned, palms scraping against the hot pavement. His vision blurred. That was when Maya saw it. She had been speaking to another teacher near the fence when she heard the laughter. Wrong, jagged, cruel. Her eyes snapped toward the sound. She saw Ethan on the ground. She ran. Not fast enough for drama. Fast enough for purpose. "Hey!" Her voice cut through the playground like a blade. Every child froze. Maya reached Ethan in seconds, dropping to her knees beside him. "Ethan," she said, hands already checking his arms, his head. "Look at me." Ethan's lip trembled. "I fell." Maya knew better. She stood. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice low, but dangerous. No one answered. The boys stared at their shoes. Maya straightened fully now, her body forming a shield in front of Ethan. "I said," she repeated, louder. "Who did this?" One boy pointed weakly at another. "He tripped." Maya's eyes narrowed. "You will walk with me," she said. "All of you." Inside the building, the hallway echoed with footsteps. The boy's bravado drained with every step. Ethan walked beside Maya, silent, tears streaking down his face. Maya kept her hand lightly on his shoulder, not gripping, not guiding, just present. They reached the principal office. Maya knocked once and entered. "Mr. Harris," she said, "we have a problem." The principal looked up, startled. "What happened?" Maya gestured to Ethan. He was pushed. The boys protested immediately. "He fell!" "We were just playing." Maya held up a hand. "Enough." The room went quiet. Mr. Harris frowned. "Johnson, let's not jump to conclusions." Maya turned to him slowly. "This is the third incident," she said. "The third. I documented the first two." Mr. Harris hesitated. "I didn't think it had escalated." "It has," Maya said firmly. "And if we don't act now, it will get worse." Mr. Harris glanced at the boys. "Go wait outside." They left quickly. Mr. Harris sighed. "I understand you're concerned, but we need to be careful." Maya's voice dropped. "Careful with what?" "With parents," he said. "With optics." Maya stared at him. "Optics?" she repeated. "Yes," he said. "We don't want to inflame tensions." Maya took a breath. "Ethan was bleeding," she said quietly. "And you're worried about inflaming adults." Mr. Harris had no answer. That evening, Ethan sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His knee was scraped. His heart hurt more. David Miller stood in the doorway. "You okay?" David asked. Ethan shrugged. "I guess." David frowned. "Kids mess around. You have to toughen up." Ethan turned his face away. The next day, Maya stood in her classroom early. She wrote 3 words on the board: safety, respect, courage. When the students arrived, she didn't start the lesson. She turned to them. "We need to talk," she said. The room stilled. "No one in this class is allowed to hurt another person," Maya continued, "with words, with actions, or with silence." Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Ethan. "And if anyone feels unsafe," she said, "you come to me." She paused. "I will protect you." Ethan looked up. For the first time in weeks, he believed an adult meant it. If this scene moved you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because what comes next will force everyone, parents, teachers, and administrators, to choose between comfort and courage. The email arrived at 7:12 a.m. Subject: urgent parent meeting, today at 10 a.m. Maya Johnson read it twice before setting her phone down. The message was brief, formal, careful. The kind of careful that meant someone was trying not to say too much in writing. She already knew who had asked for it. By 9:58, Maya stood outside the principal office, hands folded loosely in front of her. Her breathing was steady, her posture calm. She had learned, long ago, that composure unsettled people who expected defensiveness. The door opened. "Ms. Johnson," Mr. Harris said, forcing a polite smile. "Please come in." Inside, David Miller sat in one of the small chairs, arms crossed tightly, jaw set. He didn't stand when Maya entered. He didn't look at her right away. Maya took the chair across from him. Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "Thank you both for coming. The purpose of this meeting is to discuss concerns regarding Ethan's recent experiences." "Experiences," David repeated flatly. "That's one way to put it." Maya met his eyes. "Your son was pushed to the ground," she said. "That's another." David leaned back. "Kids' roughhouse." "This wasn't roughhousing," Maya replied evenly. "It was targeted." David scoffed. "According to you." Maya didn't react. She turned to Mr. Harris. "I submitted incident reports, dates, witnesses." Mr. Harris nodded. "Yes, we've reviewed them." David waved a hand dismissively. "Look, my issue isn't just the incident, it's the environment." Maya felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "What environment?" David leaned forward. "The classroom, the tone, the culture." There it was again. Maya waited. "I've noticed Ethan has been withdrawn," David continued. "He didn't used to be like that." "Neither do children who feel unsafe," Maya said. David's eyes hardened. "Or children who are being influenced." Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably. "Let's stay focused." "I am focused," David snapped. He turned back to Maya. "My son comes home confused, quiet. He doesn't want to talk. And I can't help wondering if that started when—" He gestured vaguely. "All this began." Maya inhaled slowly. "Ethan is being bullied," she said. "And the bullying intensified after you publicly questioned my presence in his classroom." David stiffened. "That's not fair." "It's factual," Maya replied. "Children mirror adult behavior. They hear more than we think." David shook his head. "You're blaming me?" "I'm asking you to listen," Maya said. Silence stretched. Mr. Harris tried to interject. "Perhaps we should consider moving Ethan to another classroom." "No," Maya said immediately. David blinked. "Excuse me?" "Moving him won't solve the problem," Maya continued. "It teaches the wrong lesson. That when harm happens, the person hurt must disappear." David's face flushed. "You don't get to tell me how to raise my son." Maya met his gaze. "I get to protect him when he's in my care." David stood abruptly. You don't understand our family, our background. Maya stood too, not aggressively, but firmly. I understand fear, she said, and I understand what happens when adults let fear decide for them. David laughed bitterly. There it is, turning this into something bigger. It is bigger, Maya said quietly, because your son is paying the price. Mr. Harris raised his hands. Please, let's de-escalate. David turned toward the door. I want him out of that class. Maya's voice didn't rise. If you remove him now, he'll think he did something wrong. David paused, but only for a second. I'll take that risk, he said. And with that, he left. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than shouting. Maya remained standing. Mr. Harris sighed. Mr. Johnson, parents can be difficult. Maya looked at him. Children shouldn't be collateral. Mr. Harris didn't respond. Outside in the hallway, Ethan sat on a bench, backpack at his feet. His leg bounced nervously. When he saw his father, he stood quickly. Dad? He asked. David didn't look at him. We're going home. Ethan glanced past him, toward the office door. Maya stepped out. Ethan's eyes met hers. Something passed between them. Confusion, fear, hope. Maya knelt so she was level with him. Hey, she said softly. You did nothing wrong. Ethan's lip trembled. Am I in trouble? No, Maya said firmly. You were brave. David scoffed. Let's go. Ethan hesitated. Ms. Johnson. Maya placed a hand over her heart. I'm here, she said. Always. Ethan nodded slowly. He followed his father down the hallway, shoulders slumped. Maya watched them go. She didn't chase, she didn't argue. But something inside her hardened, not into anger, but resolve. Because the problem was no longer misunderstanding. It was refusal. And refusals, when left unchallenged, become permission. That afternoon, Maya stayed late. She sat alone in her classroom, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the quiet. She reviewed notes, incident logs, policies. She wasn't looking for approval. She was preparing to act. If this scene made your chest tighten, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because the next moment won't be quiet. And when a line is crossed, one teacher will stand between a child and a crowd that thinks no one is watching. The sky was clear. Too clear for what was about to happen. It was just past noon when the lunch bell rang, and children spilled out onto the school playground, their voices sharp with freedom. Shoes pounded against concrete. Laughter cut through the air. Teachers took their usual positions along the edges, scanning casually. Maya Johnson stood near the doors, arms folded loosely, eyes alert. She had learned not to relax. Not today. Across the playground, Ethan Miller stood alone near the far fence, backpack still on his shoulders, even though lunch had ended. He hadn't wanted to go inside. Inside meant questions. Outside meant distance. Or so he thought. 3 boys approached him. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They walked slowly, deliberately, like they had rehearsed this. Ethan noticed them too late. Why are you still here? One boy asked, blocking his path. I'm just... Ethan stopped himself. I'm waiting. For who? Another boy sneered. Your teacher? The third boy laughed. She's not going to save you. Ethan's heart began to pound. He glanced toward the building, scanning for adults. Too far. You think you're special? The first boy said. My dad said kids like you get special treatment. Ethan shook his head. Leave me alone. The boy stepped closer. Or what? Ethan tried to move past them. A hand shoved his shoulder. Hard. He lost his balance. The ground rushed up to meet him. His head hit the pavement with a sharp, hollow sound that cut through the noise of the playground. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then the laughter exploded. Maya heard it. Not laughter. That laughter. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She ran, not yelling, not hesitating. She ran straight toward Ethan. "Stop!" Her voice cracked across the playground like thunder. Every child froze. Maya dropped to her knees beside Ethan, one arm immediately cradling his head, the other shielding his body. "Ethan," she said, voice steady despite the fear burning in her chest. "Look at me. Can you hear me?" Ethan blinked, tears spilling freely now. "It hurts." "I know," Maya said softly. "I've got you." Blood trickled from a small cut above his eyebrow. Maya felt it then, rage, sharp and dangerous, but she forced it down. This wasn't about them. It was about him. She stood, and without thinking, she stepped fully in front of Ethan, placing her body between him and the three boys. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared. "You," she said, pointing. "Step away. Now." The boys hesitated. No one had ever spoken to them like that. "I said now," Maya repeated, louder. They backed up. Maya didn't move until another teacher arrived, breathless. "What happened?" the teacher asked. "He was assaulted," Maya said flatly. "Get the nurse." She turned back to Ethan, kneeling again. "We're going inside, okay?" Ethan nodded weakly. As they walked towards the building, children whispered. Phones came out. Someone had recorded it. Maya didn't care. The hallway felt colder. The nurse rushed Ethan into the clinic. Maya stood just outside the door, arms crossed tightly, trying to slow her breathing. The principal arrived moments later. "Ms. Johnson," Mr. Harris said sharply. "What happened?" Maya didn't soften her words. Ethan was shoved. He hit his head. This was not an accident. Mr. Harris frowned. "Were you supervising the area?" "Yes," Maya replied. "And I intervened." "Mr. Harris glanced down the hall, lowering his voice. "Some parents are already upset." Maya stared at him. A child was hurt. "Yes, but—" "No," Maya cut in. "There is no but." Her voice wasn't loud, it was absolute. Mr. Harris blinked. "I warned you," Maya continued. "This would escalate if it wasn't addressed." Mr. Harris sighed. "We'll review the footage." "You'll do more than review," Maya said. "You'll act." The nurse opened the door. "He has a mild concussion. He needs to go home." Maya's chest tightened. "His father?" Mr. Harris asked. "I'll call him," Maya said. David Miller arrived 15 minutes later, his face drained of color when he saw the bandage on Ethan's head. "What happened?" he demanded. Ethan looked down. Maya stepped forward. "He was pushed," she said, "multiple times." David's jaw tightened. "By who?" "We're identifying the students," Mr. Harris said. David turned to Maya. "Where were you?" "Right where I should have been," Maya replied. "In front of him." David hesitated. Ethan looked up then, voice trembling. "She stopped them, Dad." David froze. "She—" he said. Maya didn't speak. Ethan continued. "She stood in front of me. They didn't touch me after." The hallway went silent. David stared at Maya. Really stared at her. Not as a symbol, not as a problem. As a woman who had put herself between his child and harm. Maya met his gaze. "I told you," she said quietly. "I would protect him." David swallowed hard. For the first time, he had no argument. If this moment hit you hard, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because in the next scene, the truth will no longer be deniable, and the parent who once turned away will be forced to face what courage actually looks like. The meeting was called for 4:30 p.m. Every parent of the 4th grade class received the same email. Brief, urgent, unmistakably serious. Subject: Mandatory Parent Conference. Incident Review. By the time Maya Johnson walked into the school auditorium, the room was already full. Chairs scraped against the floor as parents shifted, murmuring in tight clusters. Some looked angry, some anxious. A few avoided eye contact altogether. Maya took a seat near the aisle, hands folded calmly in her lap. Inside, her heart pounded. Not with fear, with certainty. At the front of the room stood Mr. Harris, the principal, his posture rigid. Beside him sat the school counselor and 2 district representatives. On the screen behind them was a paused video frame, blurred, frozen, waiting. Maya knew what it was. The footage. Parents quieted as Mr. Harris cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. "We're here to address a serious incident that occurred during recess today involving a student injury." A murmur swept through the room. David Miller sat in the second row, Ethan beside him. Ethan's head was bandaged. His feet didn't touch the floor. Maya felt a familiar tightening in her chest at the sight, but she didn't look away. Mr. Harris continued, "We will be reviewing footage from the playground camera." A click. The video began to play. The playground appeared on screen, bright under the afternoon sun. Children ran, laughed. Then the camera caught movement near the far fence. 3 boys, 1 smaller boy, Ethan. The room grew still. Parents leaned forward. The video showed Ethan trying to walk away, the boys circling him. One shove, then another, then the fall. A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. The video continued. Maya appeared in frame, running, dropping to her knees, pulling Ethan close, standing, stepping forward, blocking. Her body clearly positioned between Ethan and the boys. The video ended. Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable kind, the heavy kind. "Mr. Harris spoke again, his voice subdued. "This footage confirms that the incident was not accidental. It was targeted, and it escalated." He paused. "It also shows Ms. Johnson intervening immediately and appropriately." Maya felt dozens of eyes turn toward her. She kept her gaze forward. A hand shot up. "My son was involved," a parent said sharply. "Are you saying this is bullying?" "Yes," Mr. Harris replied. "That is exactly what we're saying." Another parent stood. "Why wasn't this handled sooner?" Maya felt that one land. Mr. Harris hesitated. Concerns were raised, but Maya stood. Every sound in the room stopped. "Because those concerns weren't taken seriously," she said calmly. David Miller stiffened. Maya turned slightly toward the parents. "I documented early signs. I reported changes in behavior. I warned this would escalate." She paused. "I was told not to inflame tensions." A murmur swept the room, uncomfortable, unsettled. David stood. His face was pale. "My son was hurt," he said, "and I want to know why." Maya met his eyes. "Because children learn who is safe to target," she said, "and they learn that from adults." The words hit harder than shouting ever could. David's mouth opened, then closed. The counselor stepped forward. "We also want to address the context surrounding this situation." She looked at David, then back to the room. "Language used by adults can influence children. Public statements, attitudes, even doubts about authority." Parents shifted. David felt every eye on him now. He cleared his throat. I raised concerns about classroom fit." Maya didn't interrupt. David continued, voice faltering. "I didn't think..." He swallowed. "I didn't think kids would take it this far." They always do, Maya said quietly. They listen more than we think. David looked at Ethan. Ethan stared at the floor. David's shoulders slumped. I was wrong, David said. The words echoed. I thought I was protecting my son, he continued, but I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. He turned toward Maya. And you protected him when I didn't. The room held its breath. Maya nodded once. I did my job, she said. I wish that was enough. Harris stepped forward. The school will be taking disciplinary action and implementing immediate anti-bullying measures. Maya didn't react. David sat down slowly. The meeting ended not with applause, but with something heavier, reckoning. Later that evening, the auditorium emptied. Maya gathered her bag near the exit. David approached cautiously. Ms. Johnson, he said. Maya turned. I owe you an apology, David said, for questioning you, for not listening. Maya studied him. I don't need an apology, she said. Your son needs consistency. David nodded. I'll do better. Maya believed he meant it. That night, Ethan slept soundly for the first time in weeks, and Maya, alone in her apartment, sat quietly at her kitchen table, replaying the video in her mind. Not the fall, the moment she stepped forward, because she knew something now. Standing up had changed the room, but it wasn't over yet. If this scene made you stop and think, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because in the next scene, words will turn into consequences, and the teacher once doubted will become the one everyone looks to for leadership. The next morning felt different. Not quieter, not calmer, heavier. Maya Johnson arrived early, as she always did. The hallway lights buzzed softly as she unlocked her classroom door. She paused for a moment before stepping inside, letting the silence settle. Yesterday's meeting still echoed in her chest. Not the accusations, not the tension, the moment when the room had finally listened. She set her bag down and straightened the desks, aligning them carefully, deliberately. Control over small things helped her prepare for the large ones. By 8:10, the hallway filled with footsteps. Students entered more slowly than usual. Fewer laughs, more glances. The children felt it too, the shift in gravity. Ethan came in last. He stopped just inside the doorway. Maya noticed immediately. Good morning, Ethan, she said gently. He looked up. This time, he didn't look away. Good morning, Ms. Johnson. His voice was still quiet, but steady. Maya smiled. I'm glad you're here. He nodded and walked to his desk. Two students watched him pass. One started to whisper, then stopped when Maya's eyes flicked in their direction. Something had changed. During the first lesson, Maya noticed hands going up that rarely did before. Students asked questions, listened more closely. The room wasn't perfect, but it was attentive. Midway through reading time, a girl raised her hand. Ms. Johnson? She asked. Yes, Olivia. My mom said what happened yesterday was wrong, the girl said, glancing around nervously. She said no one should be treated like that. A few heads nodded. Maya took a breath. Your mom is right, she said, and it's important to say that out loud. She scanned the room. This classroom is a place where everyone deserves respect, Maya continued. And respect isn't just about being kind. It's about speaking up when something isn't right. Silence followed, not awkward, but thoughtful. Ethan's shoulders eased. At recess, Maya stood near the playground again. The same space, different energy. The boys who had shoved Ethan stayed close to the basketball court, glancing at him, but not approaching. One of them kicked at the ground, restless. Ethan walked toward the swings. Another boy hesitated, then followed. Want to play? The boy asked awkwardly. Ethan blinked. Okay. Maya watched from a distance. She didn't intervene. She didn't need to. Inside the building, the school hallway buzzed with quiet conversations among teachers. Did you see the footage? I didn't realize it was that bad. She handled it incredibly. Maya passed them, nodding politely. In the principal office, Mr. Harris waited. Ms. Johnson, he said, do you have a moment? She stepped inside. He gestured to a chair. I wanted to follow up. Maya sat. I should have listened sooner, Mr. Harris admitted. You were right. Maya met his eyes. This isn't about being right, she said. It's about being responsible. He nodded. The district wants you to help lead the new anti-bullying initiative. Maya blinked. Me? You have credibility, he said, with students and parents. Maya thought of the meeting, of the video, of Ethan's bandaged head. I'll do it, she said, but only if it's real, not a presentation, not a poster. Mr. Harris nodded quickly, agreed. That afternoon, Maya found Ethan sitting in the library, reading. She approached quietly. How's your head? She asked. He touched the bandage lightly. It's okay, she nodded. How's everything else? Ethan hesitated. Different. Different can be good, Maya said. He looked up at her. My dad said he was wrong. Maya felt something soften in her chest. I'm glad, she said. Ethan swallowed. He said you were brave. Maya smiled gently. You were brave too. Ethan shook his head. You stood in front of me. Maya leaned closer. Sometimes, she said, being brave means letting someone stand with you. He thought about that. Ms. Johnson? He asked. Yes? Are you going to leave? He asked quietly. The question landed heavier than any accusation. Maya knelt beside him. No, she said firmly. I'm not going anywhere. Ethan nodded, relief washing across his face. That evening, David Miller stood outside the classroom door. He waited until the hallway was empty. Maya, he said quietly when she stepped out. She stopped. I wanted to thank you, he said. Again. And I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. Maya studied him. I hope you mean it, she said. I do, David replied. And I'm trying to teach Ethan to speak up now, not stay quiet. Maya nodded. That matters. David hesitated. You didn't have to do what you did. Maya met his gaze. Yes, she said. I did. David nodded, understanding. That night, Maya sat alone in her apartment, grading papers. She paused over a drawing from one of her students. It showed a classroom, a teacher, children holding hands. At the bottom, written in careful letters, "Thank you for protecting us." Maya closed her eyes. The room had changed, not because people felt guilty, but because someone had stood still when everyone else stepped back. If this scene stayed with you, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because in the next and final moments, the story will come full circle, and the teacher once questioned will become the standard everyone measures themselves against. The invitation came from the district office, not an email this time, a phone call. Maya Johnson, a calm voice asked. This is the Oregon School District. Maya paused, phone pressed to her ear, papers spread across her kitchen table. Yes, this is Maya. We'd like you to attend a community forum this Friday, the voice continued. Parents, teachers, administrators, we want to talk about student safety and inclusion. Maya knew what that meant. They wanted her in the room, not as a teacher, not as a target, as a voice. I'll be there, Maya said. By Friday evening, the school auditorium was full again, but this time the energy was different. No whispers, no crossed arms. Parents sat beside teachers. Students filled the front rows. The stage was set with a long table and microphones. A banner hung overhead, creating safe spaces for every child. Maya sat near the aisle, hands folded, heart steady. She noticed David Miller across the room, sitting beside Ethan. David didn't look defensive now. He looked nervous. The moderator stepped up. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight is about listening." Maya felt the weight of that word, listening. The discussion began with statistics, policies, planned programs. Then the moderator turned. "We'd like to invite Ms. Maya Johnson to speak." A hush fell over the room. Maya stood. She didn't rush. She didn't smile. She walked to the microphone with the same calm resolve she carried into her classroom every day. "I didn't plan to speak publicly," Maya began. "I planned to teach." She let the words settle. But when children are harmed, silence becomes a choice, and it's never a neutral one. The room stayed quiet. "I was told I didn't understand the culture of this community," Maya continued. "But I understand fear. I understand exclusion. And I understand what happens when adults let discomfort outweigh responsibility." She paused. "When a child is targeted, they're not just hurt by hands. They're hurt by what we excuse, what we dismiss, what we fail to name." Maya looked toward the front row, toward Ethan. "He didn't need saving," she said. "He needed protection." A murmur rippled through the room. "I didn't step in because I was brave," Maya continued. "I stepped in because that is what educators are meant to do. And if that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe that discomfort is necessary." Applause broke out. Not thunderous, not performative, real. Maya stepped back. After the forum, people approached her slowly. A mother wiped tears from her eyes. "My daughter's been quiet too," she whispered. A teacher shook her hand. "You said what we couldn't." Maya listened. She didn't posture. She didn't claim credit. She stayed. David approached last. He waited until the crowd thinned. "Maya," he said quietly. She turned. "I watched Ethan tonight," David said. "He wasn't scared. He wasn't shrinking." Maya nodded. "That matters." David swallowed. "I used to think protecting my son meant controlling his environment." Maya waited. "I realize now it means standing up, even when it's uncomfortable." Maya met his gaze. "Especially then." David nodded. "Thank you for not turning away." Maya said nothing. She didn't need to. The following week, the change became visible. Posters appeared in hallways, not slogans, but student-written commitments. Teachers received training, not generic modules, but facilitated discussions. Maya led them. In the classroom, she guided conversations about empathy, power, and responsibility. Age, appropriate, honest. "Words matter," she told her students. "And so does silence." Ethan raised his hand. "Yes?" Maya said. "I think being quiet can be scary," he said. "But being mean is worse." Maya smiled. "That's very true." Other students nodded. The boys who had pushed Ethan sat stiffly, but listened. One afternoon, Maya was called back to the principal office. Mr. Harris looked nervous. "The district has made a decision," he said. Maya folded her hands. "Okay." "They want to appoint you as the lead for the school's inclusion and safety program," he said. "Permanent." Maya blinked. "I'm a classroom teacher." "And you'll remain one," he said quickly. "But they want your voice at the table." Maya thought of the meeting months ago. The chair scraping. The objection. She nodded once. "I'll accept." That evening, Maya stayed late again. She stood alone in her classroom, watching the sun dip low through the windows. Ethan stopped at the door. "Miss Johnson?" he asked. "Yes." My dad said he's proud of me, Ethan said. For telling the truth. Maya smiled. You should be. Ethan hesitated. Are you proud of me too? Maya knelt so they were eye to eye. Very, she said. Always. Ethan smiled, a full one this time. As Maya locked the classroom door, she reflected on how quickly roles could change. She had walked into that school questioned. She stood now as someone people turned to when things went wrong. Not because she demanded authority, but because she never stepped away from responsibility. If this scene made you feel the shift, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because in the final chapter, we'll see how courage doesn't just protect one child, it reshapes a community and redefines what leadership truly looks like. Not with announcements or assemblies, but with windows left open, with children shedding jackets, with sunlight lingering a little longer in the halls of Lincoln Elementary School. For Maya Johnson, the school felt different now. Not easier, not perfect, but honest. She stood at the front of her classroom, watching her students work in small groups. Their voices overlapped, debating, laughing, disagreeing, resolving. The noise was healthy, alive. In the back of the room, Ethan Miller leaned over a worksheet with two other students. He spoke without hesitation, pointing at the page, explaining his thinking. The boys listened. Maya noticed. She always noticed. A few months ago, Ethan had tried to disappear into his desk. Now he sat upright, shoulders relaxed, eyes bright. He wasn't louder than the others, but he was present. That mattered. The bell rang. As students packed up, Maya clapped her hands once. Before you go, she said, I want to remind you, tomorrow is our community day. A collective groan rose. Maya smiled. It means parents, teachers, and students working together. Ethan raised his hand. My dad's coming. Maya nodded. Good. She meant it. The community park buzzed with activity the next morning. Folding tables lined the grass. Banners made by students fluttered gently in the breeze. Parents arrived carrying coffee and cautious smiles. Maya moved between groups, greeting families, answering questions, helping set up activities. She wasn't directing. She was participating. David Miller arrived holding a box of supplies. Ethan walked beside him, relaxed. David spotted Maya and hesitated, then walked over. Good morning, he said. Morning, Maya replied. David shifted the box in his arms. I wanted to say, I've been listening. Maya studied him. That's good. David nodded. Ethan's different. He talks more. He asks questions. He told me he feels safe. Maya glanced at Ethan, who was laughing with another child. That's what every child deserves, she said. David swallowed. I used to think keeping my son safe meant controlling what he was exposed to. Maya waited. I understand now, David continued, that it means teaching him how to stand up, without becoming the one who hurts others. Maya nodded. That lesson lasts longer. David hesitated. I was wrong about you. Maya met his eyes. I know. He exhaled. Thank you for not turning away. Maya looked back at the children running across the grass. I didn't do this for you, she said gently. I did it for them. David nodded. I understand. Later, a small crowd gathered near the stage set up at the edge of the park. Mr. Harris tapped the microphone. I'd like to say a few words, he began. This year challenged us. A murmur of agreement followed. It exposed our blind spots, he continued, and it forced us to confront uncomfortable truths. He gestured toward Maya. One of those truths is that leadership doesn't always come from titles. Sometimes it comes from action. Applause rose. Maya felt heat rise to her face, but she didn't look away. Mr. Harris continued. Johnson reminded us that protecting children means more than policies. It means courage. Maya stepped forward briefly, raising a hand. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about what we choose to do when it matters." The applause softened, but didn't stop. That afternoon, Maya sat on a bench at the edge of the park, watching students paint a mural together. The image took shape slowly. Children of different colors, hand in hand, standing in front of a school. Ethan approached, holding a brush. "Ms. Johnson," he asked. "Yes?" "I'm painting the door," he said, "because it's open." Maya smiled. "That's a good choice." He hesitated. "When they pushed me, I thought no one would help." Maya's chest tightened. "But you did," Ethan continued. "You didn't think. You just stood there." Maya nodded. "That's what adults are supposed to do." Ethan thought for a moment. "I want to do that too, when I'm older." Maya looked at him carefully. "You already are." Ethan grinned and ran back to the mural. As the day wound down, families began to leave. Laughter lingered in the air. The mural dried in the sun. Maya stayed behind, helping fold tables. David returned one last time. "Maya," he said, "if you ever need support." She raised a hand gently. "Just keep listening," she said, "and teach Ethan to do the same." David nodded. "I will." That evening, Maya stood alone in her classroom once more. She looked at the desks, the whiteboard, the drawings taped to the walls. She thought about the first meeting, the objection, the silence. She thought about the moment she stepped in front of Ethan, not knowing what would follow. She hadn't changed the world, but she had changed a room, a hallway, a child's understanding of safety. Sometimes that was enough. Maya turned off the lights and closed the door behind her. Tomorrow she would teach again, and now she wouldn't be questioned for it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who believes courage doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Because the strongest protection a child can have is an adult who refuses to look away.